Aditya, airlift. India got Ukraine and Russia to create a temporary ceasefire corridor so that they could evacuate students. Is it part of that not an era of war philosophy that helped us so much?
Well, no country is ready to believe that. But it actually happened. You know, I was tracking this very closely, and this was the time when one of the Indians, unfortunately, had been killed as well in one of the areas where majority of the medical students were stranded. And we were tracking this very closely. Our reporters were there on ground from TV9. And suddenly we see these phone calls doing rounds between Putin, Zelensky, and of course, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, trying to see that was there a ceasefire a possibility. But he tried to convince both these leaders that ceasefire was a necessity because there were more than 20,000 Indians who were stranded there, most of them medical students. And he made the most impossible possible. And then the Indian diplomats, the Indian medics and Indian volunteers stepped in, brought in buses inside the interiors of Ukraine and actually rescued 22,000 people. And mind you, it was not just Indians. They were Pakistani nationals, they were nationals from Malaysia, from different other countries who were rescued as well. So this is a phenomenal exercise that India has engaged in over the last many years, where not just Ukraine, you know, the recent Israel-Hamas war, a lot of Indians had to come back. We arranged that. Before that, we had the similar situation in Afghanistan. Amidst Taliban takeover, a lot of death, mayhem being noticed, that bomb blast that happened at the Hamid Karzai International Airport, and still Indians were rescued, and that was a dramatic story as well, because you know, Indians were traveling in Kabul towards the airport and the Taliban stopped them. The convoy, the ambassador was there, and then suddenly there were some phone calls doing rounds, and suddenly that convoy moved again, and there were only 12 Indian representatives from the government, from different agencies, who were waiting for them and finally made that last flight out.
And 4 union ministers were sent there.
Absolutely. To Ukraine and all 4 corners from different countries that were managing. And there were a lot of voluntary organizations like ISKCON, you know, Art of Living and others who were chipping in as well. But a phenomenal job. Actually, a Bollywood or a Hollywood film can be made on this kind of a rescue mission, but this has happened continuously in the Middle East, in other places where General V.K. Singh or other leaders have stepped in. But India has ensured that Indians are rescued.
One big great takeaway from India's foreign policy, is it not, Neha? The fact that, you know, no Indian left behind.
Absolutely.
And that's something that you used to see of Western countries. You know, when their nationals are stuck, you have Americans going in, the Marines going there and evacuating them in choppers and all that. Now you have that happening with Indians as well, right? You have Air Force jets landing in the middle of Sudan in the desert.
Just imagine.
Airlifting people out of there.
I think that we've seen multiple examples of that. Perhaps the most iconic in some ways is, of course, the what happened during the Kuwait War in the 90s. You know, I think that was the single largest rescue mission, more than 1 lakh who were brought back home. The movie starring Akshay Kumar called Airlift was also based on that entire episode. And then in recent years, we've seen it happen during the Ukraine War, we've seen it happen during the Sudan conflict, and the most recent example, the 8 Navy veterans who were on death row in Qatar. You know, the court judgment came as an absolute shocker to all Indians. Next thing you know, the government of India intervenes in the matter. The sentences get commuted first, and suddenly overnight comes the great news that the men have been set free and 7 out of 8 of them are already back home.
But you know, the interesting angle here in Ukraine is that Americans and Chinese were stranded. They were stranded for many, many weeks and months. And no American president, no Chinese president actually stepped in to rescue them. And they kept appealing on social media or different platforms, please rescue us. And this was the time when the Indian diplomats actually went inside amidst a war, actually risking their lives, and actually brought in all the Indians.
I agree. And even during the Sudan war, I think what's notable, and Aditya referred to this, is how we rescued people of other nationalities too, not just Indians.
Just, you know, rising tide lifts all boats, as they say. In fact, let's, on that note, let's watch this story by News9 Plus. Justin put that together on year 2, when year 2 of the Russia-Ukraine war was had begun. Justin did that story. Let's take a look at that.
Putin thought Ukraine was weak and the West was divided. He thought he could outlast us, but he's just been plain wrong.
Киевского режима заполучить ядерное оружие. Ведь говорили об этом публично, не для них. За долгие века колониализма, диктата, гегемонии они привыкли, что им все позволено.
Putin is a dictator. He's surrounded by people who share the same views of Ukraine, that Ukraine is not a state. And unfortunately, I think this conflict could go on and on.
His demand, basic demand, always has been that no entry of Georgia and Ukraine to NATO, because then Russia is left defenseless.
Have they underestimated Putin? Well, in a sense, they have.
Justin, year 3 has now begun in the war. What's your take? How long is this going to last?
If you've seen the news recently, almost the eastern sector again, the Russians, though it's more of a moral victory, but it's enough to show Ukrainians their own place, their own, because they are running out of ammunition again. They're running out of partners, and this falls well in line with what Putin wants, because at the end of the day, he's not there to conquer the entire Ukraine. He doesn't want that.
He just wants the Russian.
He just wants the Russian parts out there, and he's already has majority of them, and he's well entrenched. The warfare that is following right now, it's all, you know, you're battling for every block by block, land by land. That will continue, and for Russians, that is their best play, because they do not bother about how many died or how many casualties happen, because because all the wars they have fought till now, there have been millions of Russians dying. So that's part of their lifestyle. They believe, I mean, the citizens of the country know that, you know, if you're sacrificing for the country, that's part of you being a Russian out there. So for Russia, for Putin, it's a war that is going to, I mean, anything that is going to gain is Russia and Putin.
Right. In fact, interesting that we have this BG of a artillery gun going off here in Ukraine, and the fact is that remarkable turnaround in Russia's military equipment, they're calling it the Kalashnikov economy, and how Russia has actually gone back to the Second World War. They're producing artillery shells at a humongous rate, something like 3 to 4 million shells.
Just one point added to that. The part that they are praising about is that with drones and artillery, they are able to, you know, the strikes they're claiming that almost 200% better strikes they're able to make when they have combined, you know, drones with artillery, and that's game changing for them.
And clearly, this generous help coming in from Russia's allies, North Korea, China, and Iran. Just this week, there were reports about how Iran has produced huge amount of missiles to Russia for its ongoing war. But Aditya, if I could just ask you this question: 2 years down the road, does it not look like Zelensky is fighting a rather lonely war here? Yes, you could argue that, you know, the NATO is behind him, President Biden, America keeps, you know, announcing new aid packages for Kiev. But fact of the matter is that, you know, the appetite in the US for continued aid and support to Kiev is decreasing. If you have a situation where Trump's come back to power in the US, that could drastically impact the way Ukraine is fighting this war in Russia. And you know, the fact that membership of NATO is not happening anytime in the foreseeable future. Russia still seems to be in a very strong position, and there's general fatigue with war. Where does that leave Ukraine and Zelensky?
Well, I'll be a devil's advocate, and I'll say that from the day one, Zelensky was always alone. You know, it was always a lonely battle for Ukraine, because, you know, they desperately were seeking a European citizen, you know, membership. And apart from that, you know, the Americans, the Europeans were doing this for propaganda. They were sending in some military aid, you know, one by one, of course. But then Zelensky alone was fighting that war. There were no massive boots on ground. There was a lot of ammunition that was sent in. But this is going to be a long war. Russia has been prepared and perhaps has surprised a lot of people with this ongoing, continuing war, which we haven't seen an end of. But I think Putin also realizes now, over the last few months, that Americans are engaged. The Americans are engaged in a second war, and this second war is between Israel and Hamas that has continued ever since the 7th October terror attack that happened, and more than 1,500 people were killed in that. And now we've had, unfortunately, 29,000 casualties in Gaza. As per the health ministry in Gaza, we don't have a definite number to it, but that war is also continuing, and Israel doesn't want to look the other way. There's a lot of global pressure on Israel, but as we have known on Israel as well, that they are certainly not going to look the other way. They are going to get inside Gaza as they have, and they are going to reoccupy that entire territory, and there will be again a new Gaza, a new reality that has been already created, and what we will see over the next 6 months will be a new Gaza that will be created. Who will govern that will be a critical question. But as I said, the proxies of Iran attacking Americans in that entire region again is a game changer, not just for the Israel-Hamas war, but for the Russia-Ukraine war as well.
That is quite true. And China, in fact, just the other day, Sandeep, was very critical of the US vetoing the Algerian resolution at the UN Security Council, which had sought an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Right. So we've seen, of course, the US unflinchingly standing behind Israel, especially at UN on multiple occasions. But there are many who believe that even Americans are losing patience with the Biden administration over his unconditional support to Netanyahu's war, given the high casualties that we've seen in Gaza. And therefore, I don't know if it's time for Prime Minister Modi to perhaps pick up the phone and speak to his friend Bibi and tell him to, this is not an era of war.
This is not an era of, exactly. And given the fact that they're looking at something like 3 parallel conflicts on, currently in the world, the Houthi conflict, and then you go north up the Red Sea, you have Israel and Hamas, and then finally you have this Russia-Ukraine war. 3 very different conflicts.
And the mastermind, Iran, behind all of this.
But Iran is the common factor in all these 3 conflicts.
Unfortunately, it's been a setback for India as well because of the economic corridor that was being spoken about. It was a big victory after the G20 summit, apart from the consensus that was achieved. And India, America, and a lot of countries were going all across and saying that this economic corridor is going to be a game changer. It is also being seen as a competition to the BRI in itself. A lot of articles were written about it. It was being analyzed threadbare because BRI isn't really a hot-selling, sexy corridor as much as it was 10 years ago. So one is that. Secondly, I think, speaking about India, has had a very interesting position when Israel and Palestine are concerned. I've been there multiple times, and I am really flabbergasted the way, people love India. Not just in Israel, but in Palestine as well. If I speak to a car mechanic and I met the president, the feeling is same for India. They remember Indira Gandhi and they remember Modi. There's no in between or before or after. So these 2 leaders are a hit globally. And in Palestine, in Israel, there's an understanding that India will stand with you. There is a lot of humanitarian aid that has gone to Palestine already in the last 5 months, but India condemns terrorism. India stands with Israel and has a strategic partnership, defense ties, a lot of it public, but most of it not public, classified.